Hi there. In today's devotion, I want to take you to Romans chapter 12. I want to ask you a question. When you pray for the personal needs. Most of the time, that is our prayer. But there is something that you can do for God instead of focusing on our need. We can focus on who God is. That is what worship is all about. So if you ask a question, what is worship? And Bible reveals what is worship, because from the beginning, from Genesis all the way, you see people begin to worship God. People called on the name of the Lord, and people reach out to God, and knowing the will of God, they were able to do things. Like Noah, he was a righteous man. In other words, that he was doing things that is pleasing to God. And then he understood what God was saying about the flood that was coming in this world. And to save him, God gave his plan and will in his life. It's the same way all through the Bible that you can see people wanted to reach out to God and come closer to him so that they can know the will and the plan of God in their life. Now, here in Romans chapter 12, Paul is writing in verse 1, says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." So, what is worship? Then Paul explains here, this is the spiritual act of worship. The spiritual act of worship is yielding our bodies as a living sacrifice to the Lord. Not like Old Testament, God desire us to burn things, on the altar, the offering that you bring. But here he says you have to offer yourself as a living sacrifice. In other words, that you are yielding yourself to God so that God can make use of you. When somebody yield their life into somebody else, then that means they are giving up their rights, giving up their will, giving up what they are pleased with. And that is the same way here. Worship is just yielding ourselves, our will and our emotions and our desire into God so that God will do whatever He desires in our life. How do you do it? It's very simple. It says in verse 2, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." So there's two parts here. One is that what we have to do, we have to not only yield our bodies as a living sacrifice. How do you do it? You do it by transforming your mind, not following the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind day after day in what God desires in our life. And that is what we begin to put in our mind. And when we do that, the result will be, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. Many of us want to know the will of God in our life. Most of the time you come into a crossroad, you want to decide whether to go this way or that way, and you want to know the will of God. The best way to know the will of God is to begin to worship Him and offer yourself as a living sacrifice and yield your mind to God. Be transformed your mind by the renewing of your mind every day. And then what happens is the result will be, and you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. God's will be revealed when you are coming close to God in worship. And why we have to do that? We have to do that so that we will be doing things that is pleasing to God. You know, that is what we offer to God. Instead of getting things from God, we want to give to God. Even though God don't need anything, but it is our privilege to give to God. We present ourselves. Greatest thing that you can present to God is yourself. Your body, mind, and spirit yielded to the will of God is the act of worship. It is the spiritual act of worship, Paul says. So the answer for how to worship God is right here. Yielding to God and His will and His desire and doing what pleases to God will be the main thing for understanding worship. So a person who worships God will be able to understand what God desires and His will is. And then it'll be easy for you to continue to do things that is pleasing to God. May God help you as you draw close to Him and understand His will and purpose in your life and be blessed. God bless you today.